88.1 The Burg, your music central. My name is Nathan. Welcome to What to Watch Weekends. It's a fine morning here in Ellensburg, and I'd like to talk about some movies today because it's What to Watch Weekends. The title tends to imply that it's about what you're supposed to watch or what I would highly recommend watching, and usually that implies movies or TV shows or short films or TV commercials or I don't know what else you watch. You don't watch a book and you don't watch a video game unless you're just watching someone play a video game, which in that case, why not just play them anyway? But that's not the point. This morning we are going to be talking about movies that you watch, surprisingly, and the movies that we are going to be talking about today come from a very iconic Japanese director by the name of Akira Kurosawa. One of my, well, he's not one of my favorites, but he is someone that I highly respect within the film industry, even though he's not no longer with us. I think he was very influential, and so do a lot of other people. A lot of the most iconic directors refer to his work as some of the more influential inspirations for some of their iconic works. For example, George Lucas of Star Wars fame heavily cites Akira Kurosawa as an inspiration for what he would then create when he would create Star Wars. As you can tell, I am very good at words this morning because everybody is tired when they wake up first thing in the morning. I woke up this morning, I was like, man, I'm tired in the mornings. It's like, no fooling. It's early in the morning and you're tired. That's such an incredible news flash, such a wide revelation. But at any rate, we are going to be talking about 5 movies by Akira Kurosawa today, the first of which being Seven Samurai from 1954, the next being The Hidden Fortress from 1958, the next being Ikaru from 1952, followed by, if I scroll down, Throne of Blood from 1957, and closing out the morning with Rashomon from 1950. So, highly recommend sticking around for the rest of the show. It's going to be a really fun one. I'll try to stay awake as long as I possibly can. No full blood promises, but I will definitely stay awake for the duration of the show. So, hope you all are excited for this as much as I am. Wow, very good English. I hope you all are excited as I am, but we're going to listen to some music before we jump into it. So, stick around. 88.1 The Burg, your music central. Welcome back to What to Watch Weekends. And on this morning, we are going to be talking about movies. Wow, I really got to learn how to tie things in together with the words, but that's neither here nor there. This morning on What to Watch Weekends, we have a very packed watch list talking about Akira Kurosawa movies, and we're going to start off with one of the most iconic movies from this incredibly iconic Japanese director, that being Seven Samurai from 1954, available to watch now at your convenience on Max, the streaming service, which, because they changed it from HBO Max to Max, it now sounds like just the name of some guy who inexplicably has a bunch of movies from HBO on demand. It's like, what am I supposed to think of this name? Am I supposed to say it's a good one? Because it's not. I personally don't like it. But again, neither here nor there. Seven Samurai is, hands down, one of the most recognizable Kurosawa movies, and for good reason. But to start off, before we get into all of those reasons why, it usually helps to kind of break down the plot of the movie first before you talk about it, just to kind of give the overall kind of summary of it, just so we all know exactly what we're talking about. Seven Samurai is about a village of farmers who live in the mountains who overhear sort of rumblings of a group of bandits who are planning to come and rob their village after the harvest season. And they eventually decide, well, we can't fully protect ourselves from these bandits, so we're going to go into a nearby town and we're going to hire some samurai, and we're going to see if they can protect us from the bandits. And would you believe it? They end up hiring 7 samurai to help them out, hence the name Seven Samurai. It's kind of a self-explanatory title. And that leads nicely into our first point, which is that I personally like the title of the movie. I think Seven Samurai is just such a concise and to-the-point title. Movies that have just like a basic title always really satisfy that need of like wanting simplicity in everything that I experience. That to me is just such a wonderful way of simplifying it. Seven Samurai. What is it about Seven Samurai? Yes, it actually is. It's just, there's something so incredibly something so incredibly gratifying about if somebody makes a joke about the title going, oh, is it about this? You can just say, yeah, very directly, it is just about seven samurai who help this town of farmers. But yes, there are samurai, there are seven of them. Technically, they may be considered ronin, who are samurai without a master to look after them, but that still counts. And one of them is technically kind of an imposter who's just trying really hard to be a samurai. But like, samurai try hard still gets a like applause for being for trying to put the effort in, and so he still falls into that category of being a samurai. So it all works together nicely. But one of the things about this movie is that I tend to have a lot of very stupid menial problems with it that I have since kind of rescinded just because I'm like, does this really matter in the grand scheme of things? And I also kind of take them back mostly because I watched this movie a couple years ago, and this was before I really knew anything about film. I hadn't watched as many movies as I have at this point in my life. I was kind of at the start of this very long binge of a lot of classic movies and a lot of the more influential films that make up a lot of film history. So I was kind of at the baby steps beginning of that process. And so when I watched Seven Samurai, I was not in the right headspace or really understanding to really take in why it was significant. I really just watched it because it was like, oh, it's the movie that invented the meet the team genre. Cool. But in reality, I think it would deserve a rewatch now with my actual experience and some minor, more developed understanding of the film language and just how you kind of construct a movie. I think it would be more worth it to rewatch it now. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is that one of my very stupid menial complaints that I had before I kind of, I guess, grew as a person and as a person who wants to make film, I had this really stupid complaint that the movie is called Seven Samurai, and I always just asked, why isn't it called The Seven Samurai? It could work better if it's called The Seven Samurai, not really understanding the fact that it's a Japanese movie, and there's a good chance that they probably can't perfectly translate it because translating from one language to another is no piece of cake. So it's very possible maybe it was called The Seven Samurai. Maybe they intentionally just didn't call it Seven Samurai, and why would they? It's like, why do you need the in the title? It's just about seven samurai. It's not like these specific seven samurai are the most significant thing ever, at least according to the filmmaker, who, when they were making it, they probably didn't think it would be as revolutionary as it is. That's how all the good movies are made. They just like make them, and they're just like, this is difficult to make. It's kind of causing a lot of problems. Is it going to be worth it in the end? And then it turns out to be like one of the most revolutionary movies of all time. So, and then the same thing was true of The Godfather, and look where that went. So the point is, I don't think they really considered, and they were just like, there's no real reason to add "the" into the title. And so, from my perspective, that complaint of mine is just incredibly stupid and pointless. So I just really wanted to bring it up to make fun of my own complaints rather than to actually complain about it, because I think it's fun to just kind of examine what my headspace was like when I first watched the movie. I also will say that when it comes to kind of developing more as a person who's into film a lot more than I used to be, I've kind of done my research here and there to kind of figure out little details and kind of think about certain things. And one of my favorite things about Seven Samurai is that it came out in 1954. And I, being a film nerd, I tend to know certain things about like what year this movie came out. I can't always list it off perfectly, but I can tell you right now that the movie I know for a fact also came out in 1954 was the original Godzilla movie. And so I stopped for a second and I went, okay, Seven Samurai is an incredibly iconic Japanese samurai movie. Godzilla is an incredibly iconic Japanese monster movie. Akira Kurosawa is just so well remembered for his contribution to the film world. And the director of the original Godzilla movie, Ishiro Honda, is well known for creating Godzilla. Here's a cool question. Do you think they knew each other? Is it kind of that situation where The Maltese Falcon and Citizen Kane were released in the same year of 1945, I believe. I'll double check that. But for those of you who don't know, Orson Welles, who created Citizen Kane, released his movie in the same year as a film noir by the name of The Maltese Falcon, because his friend John Huston, who was the director of that movie, was a friend of his. And they were just like, hey, wouldn't it be funny if we released these two movies in the same year? And both of those are just incredibly iconic masterpieces. So I was wondering to myself, were Ishiro Honda and Akira Kurosawa friends like that? Did they plan to release their giant monster movie and their kind of Akira Kurosawa's biggest production, which is Seven Samurai? It was kind of the most expensive and costly one that he kind of took on. And I was like, did they kind of do that intentionally again? Is that what happened? So I looked it up and I found out something incredibly wonderful. Not only was it at least halfway intentional, Akira Kurosawa and Ishiro Honda were like very good friends, to the point of like Ishiro Honda, not Hondo, Honda, was actually like assistant director on a couple of Akira Kurosawa's movies. So that means that the creator of Godzilla helped one of the most iconic Japanese directors of all time. And not everybody knows that. And I really like to know that kind of thing. I think it's just really cool. It's just fun to imagine the scenario of this guy who's well known for making samurai movies and standing out above the crowd and basically inventing genres in and of himself, being friends with the guy who created Godzilla. Both of them changed cinema forever, just in different ways. One of them basically invented entire genres of the medium of film, while the other basically created a cultural icon that is far from dead even today. That to me is just such a cool thing to imagine the conversations they would have had, the way they interacted, like that just, and they were like close friends too. They were very good friends. Like, of course they were just assistant, like it's assistant director, that kind of thing. But like, just because they work together doesn't mean that they're always like friends. They worked together because they were friends. That's the way I'm trying to kind of sell it to you. They were friends beforehand, and then they were just like, oh, we should work together. In fact, Akira Kurosawa even convinced Ishiro Honda to come out of retirement and get back into filmmaking. That's how close they were. They straight up just encouraged each other in their work while also being legitimate friends on the side. Like, I could gush about this for so long because I find it such a cool concept that was perfectly inspired by the fact that I noticed that Seven Samurai came out in 1954 and the original Godzilla movie also came out in 1954. It's just a fun little thing that I picked up on, and it led me down a path that I was very happy to end up on. Also, to confirm it, Orson Welles and John Huston both released Maltese Falcon and Citizen Kane in 1941. So that's where that year comes from. And with that, I don't really have too much more to say about Seven Samurai. I've said a lot about it on What to Watch Wednesdays this last Wednesday. For those of you who weren't listening into that one, it basically invented the Meet the Team genre. Everything from the Avengers to the A-Team took inspiration from it. Basically, every heist movie ever takes some inspiration from this gathering of the Seven Samurai. There it is again. But this gathering is just incredibly iconic. So many of the scenes have been kind of copied and taken inspiration from. It's a very influential and revolutionary movie that I had problems with when I first watched it, but because I wasn't super well versed, a lot of my complaints are ones that I tend to kind of push to the side because they don't really apply anymore, and I don't think they actually hold any weight as legitimate complaints. And so, honestly, I just more so recommend watching the movie and just taking my word for it that it's iconic for a reason. Spielberg and multiple people have just said that it's a movie that they really enjoy, and it's a movie that's worth watching. And so I think I should just leave you with that and my very nerdy story about Kurosawa and Godzilla director guy. So, we're going to take another quick break. When we come back, we are going to talk about The Hidden Fortress, also directed by Akira Kurosawa. So, stick around. 88.1 The Burg, your music central. Welcome back to What to Watch Weekends. For our second movie on the watch list this morning, we are going to be taking a look at another Akira Kurosawa movie, the famous Japanese director, that is, but another one of his movies, that being The Hidden Fortress from 1958, available to watch on Max. So, like with Seven Samurai, the movie I talked about during the last break, The Hidden Fortress is an incredibly iconic and memorable movie that has influenced filmmakers for basically ever since it came out. Most notably, The Hidden Fortress is often credited with being one of the direct inspirations for the movie that I think, a movie that a few people have heard of before. It's called Star Wars. It's from, dang it. I mentioned during the last break I don't exactly know when all the iconic movies came out. I don't remember years perfectly, and I just remembered I don't remember when Star Wars came out. Oopsies. I think it was 1974. Man, that's a shot in the dark. I'm gonna have to look that up. I have to maintain my credibility. Hang on a second. Tell me I'm right. Tell me I'm right, please. 1977. Dang it. I was 3 years off. Anyway, so The Hidden Fortress from 1958 is the inspiration for the little-known indie flick from 1977, Star Wars: A New Hope. The Hidden Fortress, its plotline follows two peasants living in the Japanese countryside who, well, not living, they're wandering through the Japanese countryside because they're peasants. They meet this man and a woman, these two kind of people who are just kind of out in the middle of nowhere, and they have to escort them to safety. Little do these peasants know that the man is a disguised general and the woman is a disguised princess, and they are actually basically helping these very important people travel across the land. Notably, they are hiding in some kind of fortress when the peasants meet them. They're hiding somewhere in the middle of kind of a big rocky desert area, and when they come over, it's just like, hey, what are you guys doing? Oh, we're hiding. Why? You'll find out later. Cool. Can you pay us money? Yes. Can you get us to safety? Yes. Cool. I guess we're gonna work together. In not that kind of word at all. Like, they don't speak like that at all in the movie, but that's the basic premise of the movie. And honestly, I was half expecting that the movie was going to be about them trying to find a hidden fortress rather than them trying to, like, just get to safety in general. They're trying to get back to the empire that they're from without kind of getting stopped or assassinated along the way. They're not trying to get to the hidden fortress. They already start out at the hidden fortress. Usually when you name a movie after kind of a location or a specific area, it tends to be kind of the MacGuffin of the story. For example, the Lord of the Rings, like the rings are kind of the MacGuffins. That's not a good example. What is a very good example? Well, let's see here. Oh, here's a good one. No, it's not. Dang it. I'm trying to think of a good example, and I can't think of any perfect examples. This is very annoying. Okay, here's a good one. And this is spoilers for the newest Dune movie, and it's kind of it's such an easy one to go for. But in the series of Dune is about a prince who travels to a planet in the future called Arrakis. Arrakis used to be called Dune in the storyline. Like, it's known as Dune. So essentially, Dune is about the planet Dune, right? It's not a very perfect example, but I'm trying to think of good ones, and I just can't. Here, let me change the subject and get to the actual point, which is I just expected it to be called The Hidden Fortress because they were going there, and they weren't, which is completely fine because the movie itself kind of stands aside from its name, as most movies tend to do if the name is well explained enough. And it is. They're starting in a hidden fortress, they're going out. Cool. That works. This is honestly a good time to bring up the fact that One of the reasons Akira Kurosawa is remembered is because of his directing style, his cinematography, the fact that he tended to co-write a lot of his movies and also be the editor on them as well as directing all of it. Like, he was a very, very involved filmmaker, and one of my favorite quotes from him goes something to the effect of, if you want to make movies, you have to know how to do every part of a production, and then you will actually be good at making movies. Like, that to me is such a memorable and powerful quote for someone like me who wants to make film, and someone who also like does video editing programs and also wants to like learn how to write and does writing on the side a little bit. It's a very inspiring sort of thing to kind of keep in mind, that you can't just go into film wanting to be a director and expect to become a director just because you're that dang brilliant that they're going to give you the role of director. You have to be good at leading a team, and you also have to be good at understanding what each job does, so you don't overwork your staff and you make sure that they're all kind of working together to create the best thing that they can. And you have to know what goes into each part of their responsibility, like what they do specifically that contributes to your final project. So that to me is just such a good quote to keep in mind for when I'm working in the industry. But all of that is to say that Akira Kurosawa was known for a lot of things. One of those things that he was known for was also working with an actor who became synonymous with a lot of Kurosawa movies, and his name is Toshiro Mifune. Toshiro Mifune is a Japanese actor, a Japanese actor who would essentially collaborate with Kurosawa on at least 10 movies, at the very least. The best way to think about it is the collaborative effort that exists between Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks, you know, with Bridge of Spies, The Pacific, The Boys, or Band of Brothers, not The Boys, Band of Brothers, The Terminal, and of course Saving Private Ryan. Like, there have been some very well-known movies that have come out of that duo, and projects in total. Although, to kind of paint the picture for you, Mifune and Kurosawa actually worked on a lot more things than Spielberg and Tom Hanks did. Like, I know what I just listed off seems like a lot, but I think after doing like a quick search, Mifune and Kurosawa worked on like a total of, let's see, Mifune Kurosawa films. Yeah, there's at least 9, how do I count? 12 or so, like 12 that I recognize off the bat going, yeah, no, they worked together on that. And I only listed about 5 things that Spielberg and Tom Hanks worked on together. So like 12 versus 5, it doesn't seem like a big difference, but this is movies. Like, this is one individual project at a time is counted as like a individual thing that they had to spend a lot of time working together on. And when it comes to the Band of Brothers with Spielberg and Tom Hanks, I'm not going to count each individual episode of the show as its own individual thing, even though it could be counted that way because TV and film are so interrelated. It's neither here nor there. The point is that Mifune and Kurosawa work together a lot more. And it's honestly, I will say, with all that background and kind of all that rambling, what I'm trying to get at is Mifune and Kurosawa were very synonymous with each other, and for a very good reason. Specifically because Mifune, I have to admit, is just built for acting. Like, he's just such a rough, tough guy. Like, he has such a kind of versatility as an actor. In some of the movies, he's playing kind of a crazy character. Sometimes he's a serious one. Sometimes he's like kind of the solemn, somber type. Sometimes he's an absolute madman. Like, I get Psycho and Madman are very interchangeable, but the point is, he has good range as an actor. He knows how to portray subtlety, and he really has honestly, the biggest standout feature of him is that he's just got a good face for acting. Like, if you look at pictures of him, you go, oh, this just looks like an average Japanese businessman. When you see him on screen actually acting, he's like completely different from that. He has such a good way of portraying himself, and like just the way he conducts his movements. It's just, he was built for acting. And so when you get someone who's just got such a natural inbuilt talent like him behind the camera or in front of the camera and Kurosawa behind the camera, what you get is something iconic. I'll go into it a little bit more when we talk about our next movie, but just keep in mind that Mifune was the general in the Hidden Fortress. He's the solemn, like somber type who is basically a indirect inspiration for Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars A New Hope. And then in Seven Samurai, he plays the crazy one who's not technically a samurai and just kind of follows along and goes through an actual character arc near the end of the movie where he decides to kind of be more serious and actually help the villagers with their problems. He's all over the place, but he's just he's just got this weird cocky attitude about him that like he's just all over the place, but he's the most memorable one out of the entire group. So keep it in mind that those two characters are played by the exact same guy. And that is incredible to me. I just love that kind of thing. I love that versatility in an actor, the ability to take on a role and just run with it. It's one thing to just be able to look pretty in front of the camera. It's another thing to look ugly in front of the camera and still look appealing at the same time and also act your heart out. That is talent right there. And combined with Kurosawa's talent for just knowing every aspect of production and taking all of it to heart, you can probably feasibly believe that the results are always legendary. So that's the big thing to keep in mind. We are going to take another quick break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about another Kurosawa movie by the name of Ikaru. So stick around for that. 8-1 The Burg, your music central. Welcome back to What to Watch Weekends. My name is Nathan, and we are going to jump into the third movie on our watch list this morning, that being the Akira Kurosawa movie Ikaru from 1952, available to watch now on Max. And as our kind of theme this morning has been Akira Kurosawa movies, it kind of makes sense to keep going with Akira Kurosawa movies. So, Ikaru, its basic plot line, follows a old bureaucrat who works in the Japanese sort of government area. I don't remember exactly if it's specifically in like a city government or he works for the directly like on the what we would consider the federal level of the Japanese government. But regardless, he's a bureaucrat for sure and works for some form of government office. And this man is diagnosed with a terminal disease after a visit to the doctor and essentially has to scramble to find a way to make his last few months of life count as much as he possibly can. So right off the bat, this movie is going to be not a happy movie just from the concept alone. From the execution, the movie is not happy. I will tell you that right now. The movie is filled with sorrow and anguish for at least the first half of it, as this man basically struggles to figure out what he's supposed to do with his life, because one of the most expert ways they kind of play off this movie is one of the most expert things they do is they kind of establish it before he gets diagnosed that his life really isn't all that fulfilling or interesting at all. It's very just kind of menial and day-to-day. He's kind of just going through all the motions to the most extreme level possible and is essentially having to deal with his son and his wife and his son's wife who live in his house, and he basically doesn't have a lot of things to say to them. That he doesn't necessarily seem to like them, and they really don't like him. They're really more concerned about getting the money from his will. His coworkers seem to like him enough just to kind of tolerate him, but he doesn't really talk to them enough. A lot of the citizens don't really seem to like him, and it's just kind of a situation where he's caught between a rock and a hard place when diagnosed with a fatal disease that he would die from, because normally people who, it's kind of an overgeneralization, but a lot of people when they're diagnosed with something quite terminal, they tend to tell people that they love. Rather unfortunately, in Ikaru, the situation is that nobody loves him and he doesn't love anyone enough to really tell them what's going to happen to him. To my memory, he does not tell anybody that he's been diagnosed with a terminal disease. And so again, as it continues, it's just one sad occurrence after the other after that, which is like nobody loves him. How more sad can you get? Well, he passes away without having told anyone and leaves everybody kind of confused as to what he was really doing with his life. Because after the halfway point, they basically cut away after he's basically struggles for a while trying to figure out what he wants to do with his life. And then after sort of a cut halfway through, they cut directly to his funeral. So he's dead, which does make sense for the context of the story. Because if a character is diagnosed with a terminal disease, it wouldn't make sense for him to just kind of disappear, or maybe like there's no significance to that happening if he just leaves the movie before he dies. Or, and this would actually be worse, if he magically got better from some terminal disease and it was like a mistake, then what's the point of the movie? So rather unfortunately, the only course of action is to have him die. But it's the way in which they portray his death which makes this movie stand out to me. Because of course, it's incredibly difficult to watch a movie that's so consistently sorrowful, and it must have taken a toll on the filmmakers, especially Kurosawa, and just the actor playing the main character. Just the overall feel of constant desperation can't be fun to make on a film set. You get exhausted making something funny. Imagine how exhausting it is to make something incredibly sad. But it really does just kind of hammer in its idea. And then about halfway through, after he's passed away, they basically have all of his coworkers, anyone who is considered to be close to him, including his son and his son's wife, all meet up, and they essentially talk about him. And then they tell, through a series of flashbacks, what he ended up doing after basically right where we left him. Like, we leave him at a certain point in his story. Then we cut away to after he dies, and then we flash back to kind of piece together what happened after we left him behind, basically. And it's basically in the span of a couple months, right before he loses his life, essentially, that they start to notice that he acts very strange. He has some weird purpose to him, and he doesn't really tell anybody what he's actually doing. He's just kind of going about it, and it all seems to have revolved around him getting something to be approved. He wants to build this neighborhood park for these citizens because he works at a government office and he works in bureaucracy, and because he has the ability to do that, but because it's bureaucracy, he's not allowed to do it. He basically goes through all the motions to make this park built. He wants it built. And the people around him who were close to him during his life, now that he's dead, have absolutely no idea why he did any of it. And they're just all sitting around at his funeral, kind of arguing and trying to go, what do you mean he did this? Why was he doing this? And it's from that we basically figure out that he essentially found his purpose and kind of just worked to fulfill that one thing with the little time he had left. Again, this is a spoiler, but it's the weekend show. I'm perfectly comfortable with spoiling the movie. And again, and with Ikaru, it's also kind of an exception, because I could tell you the plot about this movie, and I've already mentioned it in detail. I've explained it in depth, but I can't begin to spoil the emotions this movie makes you feel. Legitimately, I can't tell you how it made me feel in a way that will actually resonate with you. I can't tell you why it made me feel the way it did, because there's no better way to understand the actual emotions you get from watching a movie than actually watching the movie. Surprisingly, or unsurprisingly, depending on how you look at it. But legitimately, I can't spoil that for you at all, which is why it's completely fine that I'm spoiling the story, because the way it's portrayed and just all the cinematography and all the music and all the ways that the actors sort of perform makes it so that the experience of being told the plot is far inferior to just watching the movie for yourself and really just kind of taking it all in, soaking it all up, and still going along with how the story sort of plays itself, how it shows its hand, and when it decides not to. So that's the biggest thing to keep in mind. And it's also important to mention that The movie, so this movie, as I was talking about with the Hidden Fortress, Kurosawa tended to work with Toshiro Mifune, this very well-built, tough guy actor who was in at least 12 of his movies. Kurosawa also tended to work with an actor by the name of Takashi Shimura. Shimura is basically like Mifune in that he also worked with a lot of other movies with Kurosawa. Specifically, he was also in The Hidden Fortress and Seven Samurai as he was one of the samurai in Seven Samurai. He was like the wise old one who basically was the first one to join up and kind of leads all of them. So he's also a very significant actor in the Akira Kurosawa universe. But in this movie, he plays the main character, this bureaucrat. And his role in this movie is so significant that his picture on Google, whenever you look at pictures of actors and they just seem to have like a headshot that they always use for their Google profile, this guy's performance as the main character in Ikaru is the pic. They took a picture from this movie and used it as the actor's profile image, is what I'm trying to say. That's how iconic his performance is. And he really is. It's deserving of that. He's such a wonderful actor and portrays his role so perfectly with such a real amount of despair, just this feeling of hopelessness and inability to understand how to deal with the situation until he finally figures it out and just kind of runs with it. That's just beautiful to me. The only complaint I have about this movie, because I think Ikaru is one of the few movies that I'm perfectly fine with giving a full 10 out of 10 to. The only thing that I think I could complain about is that the main character's son and his son's wife are incredibly one-dimensional until you kind of consider that, sure, they only want his will, but that's a commentary on how at the time in Japan, young people just didn't seem to respect their elders. Because Japan is so focused on family life and just kind of putting your family first over you, it was very disheartening to someone like Kurosawa, who was a bit older at the time, to see this kind of thing become more of a social trend, to just not respect your parents anymore. That was the reason they were one-dimensional, just wanted his will. And from a certain perspective, they basically, they basically serve as functional reminders for the main character that his life sucks and he wants to be better. He wants to live something that means something, and instead he's just stuck with a very annoying son who just wants money from him. So even though they're quote-unquote one-dimensional, they still have two elements to them that make them worth like watching in the movie. They deserve to be there, and they serve that last stretch of the movie where everyone's just sitting around not figuring it out, and the son's just sitting there pretending like he knows everything, and there's just such a perfect amount of dramatic irony as you go, he hated you, dude. Like, he hated you. You hated him. You have no right to speak, and you will never figure out what he found in those last couple months of his life. You did not deserve to know how he found purpose. It's just such a weird catharsis that you get from the movie. Just highly recommend Ikaru so much. I personally give it a 10 out of 10. I really love it. With that being said, we are going to take a quick break, and we are going to come back. And when we come back, we're going to look at some other Kurosawa movies. So I am very excited for that, and I hope you are too, so stick around. 88.1 The Burg, your Music Central. Welcome back to What to Watch Weekends. We are going to continue our story today. Our story, yes, this is a story now. Our reviews this morning with another movie by Akira Kurosawa by the name of Throne of Blood from 1957, available to watch now on Max. Oh, excuse me. Wow. Throne of Blood is another one of those Kurosawa movies that's widely significant in the realm of cinema. It's honestly one of the more iconic ones out there. Well, a lot of them are more iconic than Throne of Blood. But Throne of Blood is very highly critically acclaimed at the same time. It's definitely, may not be the most iconic one, but it's definitely a remembered one, to say the least. A lot of Kurosawa movies are like that. And so I guess it just makes more sense to just jump straight into what exactly Throne of Blood is. Throne of Blood follows this basically the Japanese warlord. A lot of Kurosawa movies are samurai movies, so it's set during the Edo period in Japan. But this warlord is approached by this mystical spirit while out in the woods, and the spirit tells him of his future, where he's going to control the kingdom. And later on, he's part of that prophecy also involves another extra step where he's going to inherit something. Essentially, he inherits the money or whatever he inherits. I don't remember the plot perfectly, but it's not important. It's not important to get it 100% accurately, so just follow me here. It's basically he inherits the first part, and the first part of this prophecy comes true. But the second part of the prophecy is that he's going to take over the kingdom from his boss. And his very scheming wife tells him, if you just want, we should be ruling the kingdom. Why do you have to wait for the prophecy to come true when you can just kill him and take the role from him? And so he does do that, and it causes a whole lot more trouble than it's worth. And the wife ends up becoming an absolute monster in the process of it. Although she already was a monster. She's just like, just kill him. I want to rule the kingdom. Do it now. So just to keep that in mind, it's a very lovely, peaceful movie, not filled with any violence or horrible war implications at all. Definitely not. It's a very just happy movie that isn't very messed up at all. It's just such a feel-good comfort movie. I can't keep doing that too ironically anymore. Throne of Blood is a movie that I saw, and I watched it before I watched The Hidden Fortress, and I really like The Hidden Fortress movie. Throne of Blood is definitely not bad at all. It's just that I personally liked The Hidden Fortress more than Throne of Blood, and if I was to compare the two and say which one I would recommend more, I'd go with Hidden Fortress. But I'd also say that Throne of Blood is worth a watch at least once for the ridiculousness of part of its setup, which I will get into in just a second. But just to keep in mind, I'm going into this going, oh yeah, it's a movie that I think was good. It just doesn't like gel with me in the way of like, oh, I'm really excited for these scenes. I really love the characters. I'm super attached to what's going on. I'm more so just watching it from a more detached perspective going, yeah, the craft on display here is phenomenal and worth praise. Like, I think it's not overrated. It's definitely earned all of the respect it gets. It's just not gelling with me in the more emotional sense just because I'm not like fully attached to every part of it, which sometimes when you watch a movie, sometimes you do want that. Scratch that. A lot of the times you do want that. So it doesn't necessarily make the movie easier to watch when that's not the case. But at the same time, I also am a person who wants to make film, and so I kind of understand the idea that sometimes you just got to watch a good movie that maybe you don't love to death, but you can at least take something away from it. And I took away a couple things from Throne of Blood, so I still considered it was worth the watch for at least a couple things that I got away from it. One of the most specific and significant things about this movie is that the story I described, it doesn't necessarily ring any bells. Or if it does, you're way too far prepared for this. But for those of you who don't understand like the significance of that kind of overall plot setup, let me tell you right now that Throne of Blood's story is not original. It's not like this fully new idea, which a lot of movies aren't that. But it's so incredibly specific what exactly they're taking inspiration from that I actually appreciate Throne of Blood for this specific reason. And that is, Throne of Blood is an adaptation of Hamlet by Shakespeare and set in the Edo period of Japan with samurais instead of kings and princes, and Prince Hamlet is now just a Japanese warlord. That, to me, is such an incredibly crazy setup, but it's not difficult at all to pitch that to me. If you came into an office and I was like a producer and you told me, okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take an ancient old sort of Victorian play, because I believe Shakespeare was Victorian. I don't care enough about Shakespeare to really know everything about him. The point is, we're going to take a Shakespeare play and we're going to make it into a movie. But instead of just adapting it for, oh, I don't know, like we're going to do like period appropriate dress, we're going to make it look like the time period that it was written in, we're going to set it exactly as Shakespeare intended it. We're instead going to make it this, I don't know, oh, what's a good one? Oh, here's a great one. What if we made Romeo and Juliet into a Western movie where Juliet is a call girl and is part of the Capulet Empire, where this group of essentially Western managers are running a call girl bar, and across the street is the Montagues, where young Romeo is a wannabe deputy who essentially goes over and meets this call girl Juliet. And I'd stop you there and go, stop. How much money do you think you're going to spend on this movie? That to me is such a funny idea. Like, adapting a Shakespeare play in exactly the wrong setting, but keeping all of the same story beats intact is just beautiful to me. And the reason I brought up Romeo and Juliet is because another movie I've seen does exactly that, just not set in a Western setting. But one of my favorite examples of this, aside from Throne of Blood at this point, has been Romeo plus Juliet, where they were just basically like, hey, let's make a movie where Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet play Romeo and Juliet, except it's set in 1970s LA and everybody has guns instead of swords. Isn't that funny? Yes, it's very funny. It's incredibly funny. And it's just in the middle of LA, the Montagues are wearing Hawaiian shirts and the Capulets are business criminals. Are you not sold on this movie? Well, let me tell you right now, you should also be sold on Throne of Blood, where they're just like Hamlet, but they're samurai this time. This time they're samurai. It's like, I wish I could think of any better examples of this kind of thing. But I personally love the idea of taking a basic, like a well-established story and adapting it into the exact wrong genre, but keeping all of the same things intact. Like, another good example, actually, and I hate to use Romeo and Juliet over and over again, but it is kind of the most famous example. West Side Story is arguably a indirect adaptation of the Romeo and Juliet story. It has a lot of the same plot beats, has a lot of the same elements to it, what with there being two sides of the same coin, just with a lot more sort of race relations thrown into the mix. But the same concept is there. The idea of the two main characters having a sort of forbidden love and ending up, and one of them at least dying near the end of the movie. And that to me is just such a interesting, like, that to me, it's also set in like a street gang setting. So it's like taking a Shakespeare play and making it into something modern and different is well worth it, in my opinion, because it's just boring to see it adapted as the way it was supposed to be. You could do that, or you could have fun with the concept. And man, to get us back on track, let me say, I think they didn't have a lot of fun, but they definitely went all out making Throne of Blood. It's not a funny movie. It's not like some goofy comedy where they spoof it. They're just straight up adapting the story of Hamlet into a Japanese samurai story. And there was definitely intention behind it. And that's why I consider Throne of Blood worth the watch, just to see the gears turning in Kurosawa's head as every frame plays in front of you, just every scene sort of folding into the next. You go, okay, I am not familiar with Hamlet at all, but I do like the way you've done this. You're definitely trying something here, and I can appreciate the attempt and the effort that you're putting into it. I think this movie would, Throne of Blood, that is, because I've mentioned a lot of other examples, but Throne of Blood specifically, being adapted from Hamlet, not being familiar with Hamlet really limits my ability to kind of comment on its like adaptational qualities or its faithfulness or just how they sort of adapted it to kind of fit into this mold of the samurai story. But I will say, it's got enough there for me to go off of and not really, and still get something out of the movie without knowing all the specifics of the plot, which I think is incredibly crucial, because if you don't know the basic plot, or at least the basic idea of it, sometimes these kinds of things can really fall on their face. As much as I love Romeo plus Juliet, it really doesn't work if you don't know anything about Romeo and Juliet. But West Side Story, on the other, by comparison, works really well even if you don't know the Romeo and Juliet story, because it injects enough of its own thing into the storyline for you to go, okay, I can tell that this, I can't even tell that it's based on something else. And unless you know that it's based on Romeo and Juliet, you're going to be like, oh, this is really cool and interesting and original. Whereas if you already know it and you kind of look at it, you can see the similarities. That's how you do it. And Throne of Blood does it that way. Massive applause for doing that. I will say, one of my half gripes, but half sort of, I guess, not notices, because that's not a word. Well, it is a word, but it doesn't fit grammatically here. One of my observations, there we go. One of my observations about Throne of Blood is that the main character has his wife who's like, you should kill the boss so that you can take over the empire. Do it now. She's an actual slug. I don't mean in the sense of her being the literal animal. I mean that she wears this weird robe and she just looks weird, and she's constantly like, she's being incredibly disgusting whenever she talks, and just the vile amount of ways she like verbally assaults the main character. It's just like, what are you doing? This is disgusting. You disgust me fully and deeply to my core. I just kept getting this image of a slug in my mind. Just like, if this person was an animal, what animal would she be? She'd be a slug, a vile, disgusting creature that everybody wants to step on. And that's really fun to watch. I mean, I think it was intentional on their part. They wouldn't have made her this way and expected the audience to necessarily root for her. She's definitely the cause of all the problems in the story, and I think that's fully intentional. It just doesn't mean that it's incredibly easy to watch that happen. It's just like, you just got to keep that in mind going into it. I will also say that with Throne of Blood, one of the more memorable scenes from the movie is the ending, where essentially after everything goes to absolute bagaluga, which is definitely a word, bagaluga, the main character and his wife are basically going to be hunted down by the army because they figure out that he killed the old one in order to gain power. And so they pull out their bow and arrows and just start shooting. And the main character is constantly running through the palace, putting his back up against a wall while arrows are piercing through that wall, and then he has to run away even further. And he ends up with a bunch of arrows in his back. He's just completely covered in them, and they're flying everywhere. It's incredibly tense. There's no music playing. All you hear is just all the flip, flip, flip noises of the arrows piercing into the walls all around them. And I do remember that the wife also gets killed during this incident in a very glorious way that is very satisfying to watch, because she's such a slug and it's not fun to watch her be alive. So it's very satisfying and cathartic to watch her be killed off in the movie. That, to me, again, it's a spoiler, but again, weekend show, it's fine. That, I believe, is part of the reason why the movie has enjoyed such critical success. Not just because of the ending, but because of all the buildup that leads up to such a satisfying ending. That's unsurprisingly how you get critical acclaim as a movie. You have to have a satisfying ending, you have to have a satisfying sort of build up to that ending, and Throne of Blood pulls off both of those things. So good job for that. So yeah, as I've said, it's not a movie that I love, but I can definitely talk about it, and I think it's a good one. So I'd at least halfway recommend it, just on the off chance of, I think it deserves the praise that it gets, like a lot of Kurosawa movies. We are going to take another break, and when we come back, we're going to look at the last Kurosawa movie that we have to talk about this morning, that being Rashomon. So stick around for that. 88.1 The Burg, your Music Central. Welcome back to What to Watch Weekends. For the last movie that we are going to be talking about this morning, we are going to be talking about the Akira Kurosawa movie Rashomon from 1950, available now to watch on Max. So I've gone off on talking about a lot of Kurosawa movies this morning, and I really like to talk about Kurosawa. I think he's a very he deserves the hype. He lives up to all the respect that he's garnered and all the kind of mentions I've heard of him, he's definitely earned his reputation through a lot of hard work. And so I think it's best to kind of close off the morning with one of his also arguably very memorable movies. All of these have been incredibly memorable or iconic to some degree, but Rashomon still falls into that category, so it's definitely worth talking about. And I could talk about so many more, but we only have so much time, and I think it's nice to just kind of close off on one of them. So might as well make it Rashomon. Rashomon's story is incredibly simple. It basically follows a samurai, not a samurai, yes, a samurai. So it's another samurai movie. Essentially, Rashomon is about a man who is put on trial, and he is accused of killing a samurai and violating the samurai's wife, which is incredibly upsetting. But to move on from that, that's the basic setup of the movie. Now, that sounds very simple. It sounds like it'd just be like a courtroom drama or something, but keep in mind, it's a samurai movie. It's set in the Edo period, so on trial essentially means that they're all sitting in a sandy yard while they basically testify to a group of elders. So, of course, as basic of a setup as you can get, it would still make for a compelling movie. What propels this film into the limelight and what makes it incredibly significant is that what it really is a retelling of the story of what actually happened. The man who is accused of killing this samurai and being very disgusting essentially tells his version of the story with certain details to it, like here's what the kind of blade was used. Did the samurai actually, did the wife actually kill the samurai? Oh, I may have done it, but he was egging me on, he was disturbing me, or I just kind of came into it and did it this way, right? So that's the guy who's being accused of it. Then they bring in the wife, who basically says, no, it happened this way. It was with a short blade, and I didn't do anything. He just did it this way, and my husband was being annoying like this, and I may have killed him, or something along those lines. It's not, the details aren't perfect. The point that I'm actually trying to make is that the wife's story is at least significantly different enough from the man being convicted of it that it basically becomes a game of who's actually telling the truth and who's making up elements, who's really telling what actually happened, an accurate retelling of the events. Because on the one hand, it's entirely possible that they could have forgotten the details, or maybe they're just getting it mixed up. But at the same time, it kind of happened. They're testifying very recently after it took place. There's a good chance that they'd remember what actually happened, and one of them is definitely lying. So that's two of the accounts, but it gets crazier than that, because then they bring in this medium who basically tells the story of the dead samurai who got killed in this event, and he tells an entirely different account of what actually happened. And then they bring in this woodcutter who was on the sidelines and kind of just observed and kind of came in and stopped it from happening, or basically kind of intervened before it could go too far, which it already went pretty far. But he basically intervenes and is the one who reports it all. And he tells the story of what actually happened, and that introduces another version of it. And you really can't tell who's actually telling the truth. And for that reason, the movie's portrayal of each event, each version of this story playing out, it's very well regarded for kind of pioneering that thing. For those of you who have kind of watched other movies before, you may have seen this kind of thing where it's like, oh, we did it like this. No, you're lying. And in this high action, flashy heist movie, it's like, oh, we did it like this. We were super professional, and then we snuck in. And then the other guy on the team goes, no, we didn't. We fell through the vent. You made a bunch of noise, and we basically shot everybody. That's how it actually happened. That specific effect, that style of filmmaking, that style of telling the story with different accounts and always changing the details up, has been referred to as the Rashomon effect. Keep that in mind. This movie was so significant that they straight up just named the effect that they would use in movies after it. Any movie after it that used that same storytelling device was just referred to as using the Rashomon method. That's incredibly significant because it just means that aside from everything Akira Kurosawa has already done, he made an entire new effect for the making of a movie. That's insane and incredibly cool. It's like, it's so crazy to me that Akira Kurosawa could have just made Seven Samurai. He could have just made the movie that inspired every heist movie and every Meet the Team movie and would have been responsible for the Avengers even happening in the first place, right? He could have just done that. But at the same time, he also had to make the movie that directly inspired Star Wars and also make a movie that invented an entirely new way to tell stories on the screen. He could have just made Seven Samurai and have still been living, like, he still would have been remembered today. Maybe not as perfectly, but he would have been noted in the footnotes because he made all of these other things in combination with that and was just such a significant director because of all of these contributions separately. He is now referred to as one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. And that's crazy to me. Just the unparalleled amount of influence he had on the industry is so significant. But before I get into kind of closing out on it, I want to give a couple final thoughts on Rashomon specifically. And I think it's worth bringing up that in comparison to some of the other movies that I've talked about today, Rashomon feels just a little bit darker for some reason. It's likely because, of course, Throne of Blood involves murdering your boss. Ikaru involves having to deal with a terminal disease. The Hidden Fortress is a kind of more of a high-spirited sort of thing that inspired Star Wars, so it doesn't really fall into that category. And Seven Samurai is a very basic story about seven samurai going to save a town. So in certain content aspects, they do include, sometimes there are scenes of like kind of brutality or overall disgusting behavior. But Rashomon is kind of the one that brings it to the forefront because, as I said, a significant part of this story and one of the things that just gets changed around a lot, or more specifically, one thing that stays the same throughout all the stories is that this bandit who attacks this samurai and his wife ends up violating the samurai's wife in a very disgusting fashion. That specific detail is kept the same throughout every one of the stories. And so when you constantly have to be reminded that that happens, it becomes a very difficult movie to watch if you're kind of sensitive to that kind of thing. And it also kind of sets a tone that's a lot darker than the other ones because in comparison, Seven Samurai does have a scene where it seems like that's kind of the case, or at least one of the samurai is in relations with a girl of the village, and it causes one of the villagers to lose his mind and be very violent. But Rashomon has it directly involved in the plot. That makes it part of the overall tone of it and something that the viewer is kind of forced to confront and can't really just push aside and kind of fast forward through, because you kind of have to watch that part in order to take in the story. You can't just avoid that part of it. It's a significant part of it. And I don't want to harp on it too much. It's just notable, and it's why I tend to say it's one of the darker ones, just for that aspect alone. It's also just got a different feel to the other ones. Specifically, like even in comparison with Ikaru, which is about trying to find meaning in your life and possibly not finding it at first, but eventually maybe finding it. This one is kind of asking more directly, human beings are disgusting. Is there any reason why we should keep going on? Should I still have faith in humanity? Like, this is just upsetting. That this is such a horrible thing to begin with, and then everybody who is involved is basically lying in some capacity because none of their stories line up. Someone has to be lying about this. Any way you look at it, it's disgusting because either the guy who did it is lying because he wants to make it seem like less than what he actually did. The wife is lying because her mind is broken from what happened to her, and so she's inadvertently lying about it. The medium who's kind of relaying the story of the dead samurai, either the dead samurai isn't actually communicating with the medium and the medium is just making stuff up, which makes it very upsetting because a man is dead and you're pretending to relay the story, or the samurai actually is talking to you and he's dead and lying about it. So even in death, humans will never stop lying about things. Or the woodcutter, who could have intervened, just comes across this scenario and does intervene, but he still lies about exactly what he saw. Any way you look at the situation, it's bad and wrong. And it's just like, okay, what do I believe anymore? And to make it just a little more confusing, keep in mind that, of course, it's set up by showing each person's testimonial at the trial. But in reality, each testimony is actually a flashback from the woodcutter, who meets this priest and a commoner at this building in the middle of the rain, and they basically talk about this recent trial. So the woodcutter is the one telling all of it, which makes it even crazier because it's entirely possible that the woodcutter is still leaving out details of the testimonials. It's just it feels like such a big lie, possibly, at the end of it, that you're like, what am I supposed to believe? Am I supposed to believe in anything? Do I believe in humanity anymore? Probably not. And you really don't until the very end, where the woodcutter they basically find this crying baby in the rain, and the woodcutter goes, "Hey, I'm just gonna take care of him because for some reason there's just a random baby here, and I'd much rather he have a life that means something rather than having to deal with the fact that I just saw a man lie about killing a samurai and violating his wife. I saw a wife who lost her mind after being violated, and I saw some medium pretend to talk to a dead samurai. I'd rather just have this baby grow up to have a happy life now." And the priest just goes, "Yeah, I think I lost faith in humanity for a very long time there, which is understandable. But you just going, hey, can I just take care of this baby? Like, I'm kind of done with humanity at this point. I kind of want to just be happy for once. At least there's some good left in the world, you know? It's kind of a bittersweet ending in that nothing is real and everything is a lie, but at least we're taking care of a baby who's been abandoned, which is still incredibly sad because it's an abandoned child." Again, like I said, Rashomon's the darkest one out of all of these. And for just no other reason than I think it works on its own, and it's just its way of portraying the story of showing the different accounts of the exact same thing happening is incredibly notable. It's influential, it's significant, and it deserves to be talked about. Much like all of Akira Kurosawa's movies deserve to be talked about. I think he again deserves his place in the annals of film history for creating entire genres and changing how we look at how a story can actually be told, what we can include in that story, and how we can kind of introduce our characters and make you sort of figure out what we're supposed to do with this movie that you've given us. That to me is the big takeaway of Kurosawa, and I will continue to watch more of his movies. I've seen many of them, most of them that I've talked about here. I've seen a couple others off to the side, and I have so many more on the watch list, and I want to rewatch some of them so much. I'll leave you with this. Whenever I watch anything Japanese, whether it be Godzilla or it be an anime of some kind, I always kind of tend to think back to Kurosawa movies, just because of their such a influential and overall well-made movie that I tend to associate it with the Japanese film industry, just because of how influential they are and just because of how iconic they are. I can't watch anything Japanese without thinking of Akira Kurosawa. So bravo for that. You have changed my perception of how I look at film, and I hope you will continue to do so as I learned even more than I already know about you. Thank you, Kurosawa. which is unfortunate because he's not alive to accept it. But I'm a college student talking on a radio. Of course, he wouldn't really accept it even if he was alive, so it's completely fine. Thank you all for listening in to What to Watch Weekends. I will be back here on the Burg next Wednesday at 8 p.m., so tune in to What to Watch Wednesdays. Then follow What to Watch Wednesdays at What to Watch Wednesdays on Instagram, and I will see you all next week here on What to Watch Weekends at 9 a.m. So thank you all, and I hope you have a good day.